Welcome back to the Prairie Farm Podcast. I'm Nicholas. This is Kent, and we have the wonderful privilege of being hosted by two of the most amazing people we have met in our prairie adventures, Nancy and John Brannaman. Man, they were not working in prairie or farming, but were working in agriculture. But on the financial side, consulting side of some, and then they retired way too young and decided to get into the actual hands-on stuff, and have started some of the coolest projects I have heard of since being on a prairie farm, and I've been on a prairie farm for a long time. So, Nancy, John, thanks for having us today, having us out in this beautiful place. But one of the things, and they just gave us a tour before we were here, but
yeah, it's really hard to nail down, what is it that Nancy and John specialize in other than kind of everything. But this is a farm that is so full of activity, so full of life, so many different species here in one place, almost all native. And even, the idea of, there's some of the farming that you wouldn't really call it traditional Iowa Midwest farming, corn and bean. There's not that going on here, but the idea of you're raising a crop for sale. But there's also right behind us and right next to us, there's this giant log kiln, and behind us a mill, because John has this other business. And what exactly, I never caught the name of the milling business.
Yeah, so the milling business is Stonehouse Timber.
Okay, Stonehouse Timber.
That's the one of the timbers on our property. That was how we always referred it to. It was the Stonehouse Timber. So we kind of went with that name. We've never found a stone house on that property, though, ever. And no one we talked to...
Sounds like false advertising.
And no one that we've talked to that has any history here remembers a stone house there. But it's always been known in the area as Stone House, the Stonehouse Timber. So we went with that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great name. Yeah, so you have the milling, you have there's even enough equipment here to really have like a small time logging operation. But then the farm side of it too, and really the way you guys have adapted your unique spot. You think of Iowa, you think of the best soil on the planet, right? But Nancy and John were dealt kind of a hard card when it comes to soil, and so they're kind of in the composting business right now as well. They got this really impressive and enviable compost pile.
It's like a mountain of compost.
They're growing their own soil. They're growing soil here, and they've had to run water lines, trench it themselves, and set up hydrants on their own to get down to some of the farther reaches of their farm for irrigation. And it's really kind of been, you probably wonder, when am I farming and when am I building a farm, right?
Well, speaking of building a farm, that is really what you guys have done, non-traditionally. But why don't you guys introduce it a little bit? Tell us a little bit about your project. And we didn't give the name on purpose. We figured we'd let you do that.
Well, let's see. I guess I'd like to go back to where it started. So we own 41 acres, and we're right along the Cedar River. We're up on a wind-blown sand and loess hill.
Yep.
And I have to credit John. He had the vision as far back as the early 1980s to buy this piece of land from his parents. So we bought the first 20 acres in the mid-'80s, just after we got married. And then I think in the early 90s or later in the 80s, we bought the Stonehouse Timber, so that we have the 41 acres. And John had always had a vision to come back to this location after we retired. And we were all over the world in our careers, and we'd come back, and John in particular would work at weed control and removing noxious honey locusts and black locusts. And when we retired, he had most of the ideas for developing this land.
That's awesome. Now, when you guys say you lived all over the place, I think it's important that our listeners hear what you mean by that exactly. Can you list some of the unique places you guys have lived?
Well, I think our first jaunt was to Ukraine in 1992, and we were doing ag development for state of Iowa and Iowa State University.
Sure.
And it's right when the Soviet Union broke up, so we took off, packed up our daughter, and she was 13 at the time, didn't want to go, of course, and went to live in rural Ukraine, right?
Wow.
In some pretty tough areas, rural areas.
15 hours south of Kiev by train.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then we enjoyed it. We really liked it. We were there a year, and then went and worked in Russia doing cooperative development for Land O'Lakes, and did that for 2 years. Came back and did some things here in eastern Iowa, and then eventually we kind of missed being overseas. So Nancy got into the Foreign Service, and we went back to Ukraine. Wow. And then I got in with USAID, and we started going as a tandem, they called it. So we were in Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Albania, and then ended our career in Juba, South Sudan. Yeah.
So I heard on I think on a podcast. I think it was Clay Newcomb's podcast. Shout out to that guy. He's got a great podcast. But I heard on his that I think it's more Western Ukraine and some of those other Eastern European countries have soil, are one of the only places in the world where their soil rivals Midwest.
Yes.
So was it fairly similar in terms of agricultural climate, or?
It was much better than here.
Wow.
Actually, the soil was probably, it's the deepest topsoil I've ever seen. We're probably 10 to 12 feet down in certain spots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just like what's in Illinois and like north central Iowa, it's the silty clay loam, the deep, rich, very productive soils.
Mollisols, right?
Mm-hmm. The big difference is the latitude. They're much further north than us, and with a shorter growing season and much drier, at least where we were in southern Ukraine. In our area, actually, they had really worked on developing the irrigation system out of the Dnieper River. So there was a big hydro plant near us and huge canals of irrigation water. They didn't use center pivot. It was more of flood irrigation in our area, and a lot of small grain. And we were there to plant Pioneer seed and Stein soybeans, Pioneer seed corn and Stein soybean seed to demonstrate American hybrids. And we had a no-till planter, and we're demonstrating no-till and use of herbicides.
So were you introducing no-till to that area, to that region?
Yeah. Yep.
Wow. How did they take it?
Oh, you have to remember, this was back in 92, and they'd just broken up, so the old collective farm system was still in effect. What's the collective farm system? So it was like where a farm would be owned by the employees, but the farm would also manage like the town and a lot of the infrastructure and things in that area. It just wasn't like a private farm. So it was kind of like the community. And then they had a sister organization to that was the state farms. So the government actually owned them. So you had private ownership through the employees on a collective farm, and the state actually ran the government farms. Wow. But they ran out of resource. And when we were there, the government couldn't provide them anything hardly anymore because they just didn't have the economy and the money.
By resources, do you mean seed to plant?
Yes.
Or?
Seed and
money,
fertilizer.
Fuel.
Keep equipment running. Yeah.
Wow.
So then what they ended up doing was when we showed up, they looked at us as the next resource. So typically they wanted us to pay for things, and like the learning curve wasn't there yet. It was still like they just needed someone to replace the government, and that was us at the time. Yeah. So we were showing them some new technology and things, and it didn't take off. Typically, as people have, like a farmer especially, they like to see the neighbor do it, the neighbor's neighbor, before in 5 years they kind of then say, okay, maybe I'll try it. But we had a project that lasted a year.
Yeah.
But now they've pretty much, I think, divided. They have small farms, but then they also have huge commercial farms. And the technology is as good as ours. I mean,
Wow.
it's the same thing. And but they're, 30,000, 40,000 acre farms typically now.
Yeah, we worked with a 35,000 acre collective farm, and there were 600 or 700 people who lived in a village. The landscape in the former Soviet Union is very, very different than the Midwest because there are not farmsteads. People who worked on the farms lived in villages and then went to work in the fields that surrounded, where the cattle facilities or there was a dairy on our farm, and then beef production on the farm that we worked with, and then huge fields. So some people have seen the images of 6 or 8 combines moving across the field from the Soviet Union. Yeah, we saw those, but unfortunately, because of the equipment was old, it had not been well maintained. The Soviet Union was running out of money years before it broke up. Slowly, there would be a line of combines that were not working as they continued to move across the wheat fields.
We
That
kind of
was-
know what that's like at Huxon Industries. Just park combines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in the last, since then, they have really advanced,
Wow.
in terms of, especially Ukraine and then parts of Russia too. But,
What would you credit that to?
I think it was because they got away from the government support, pretty much. It was
Yeah.
where the private sector came in, and and it was usually foreign investors that came in and would purchase a farm or provide equipment and things. Well, then the entrepreneurs in Ukraine learned from that again, and then they stepped up. And so, if you had 1 or 2 acres that was yours because you belonged to a collective farm, an old collective farm, you didn't want to farm it. So you would lease it to somebody else. Well, they aggregate all that. And then all of a sudden they'd have a commercial entity. Yeah.
Well, that's all fascinating to see how other countries do that, and I got a few questions for you on your experience there. Whenever I hear of people leaving and going and living in another country, whether that's somebody who's immigrated to the United States from another country or somebody who's going on a long, like you guys did, a kind of a little side journey within your career life, do you feel like you're missing out a lot from what's going on back at quote unquote home when you're out in the field like that? Or is it just every day is a new experience? You don't, everything's so, flying at you so fast as you're learning everything new for the first time that you don't even have time to think about that.
I think that we hit a good balance of that. That's a great question, Kent, because I think that I for one enjoy adventure, and I was an exchange student in high school, and going to Ukraine in '92 was I was really interested in the Soviet Union and what were the people like, and because they were always the enemy of the United States, but it was the people I was interested in. I think we were pretty isolated those 3 years in the '90s because the internet was not well developed, and we didn't have good connection to internet anyway. When we joined the Foreign Service, I worked for the U.S. Department of State, and John worked then for U.S. Agency for International Development. We were in the embassy community, so we had good access to information, and at home we had AFN, which was a military media service for television. So we could get the news, the regular, ABC, NBC, CBS news, and a lot of popular television programs and things like that. And we had diplomatic pouch and could get mail on a very timely basis, as opposed to those early years in Ukraine. We relied on mail when people came to visit us. We hosted visiting groups of educators there were like extension educators and representatives from industry they conducted short courses for agribusiness and farm professionals in Ukraine. That was part of our project. And they would bring us, Quaker instant oatmeal and fruit roll-ups.
All the things you couldn't get.
And the mail.
Very nice, very nice. Now Nicholas can chop this out of here and can edit this out, but you told us a fascinating story about a hosting that kind of went awry and ended up with your personal safety being at risk and having to be flown back home emergency evacuation style. Could you give us our listeners a quick rundown of that adventure or misadventure maybe?
Well, when we were working in Russia, this was 93 to 95, there was the office of our project was in Moscow, and we were 5 hours away in a town of 15,000. And the office had a couple of vehicles, and we were hosting farmer-to-farmer farmers and also agribusiness professionals. And we had an agribusiness professional that had finished up in our village, in our project, and went back to Moscow. And unfortunately, he and the driver went out drinking, and the driver of the vehicle was driving on a busy Moscow street and rear-ended a car that hit a tram, which is very heavy electric rail car on the streets of many cities in Europe, and the car that he hit and that people were injured in that car, and we learned they were members of the Dagestani Mafia, and they actually the driver abandoned the car and on a weekend, and we're not able to get a hold of the manager of our project, our company's project, on the weekend, and at the time, it was licensed to the embassy, to the U.S. Embassy. So they got the police call about the vehicle, and that was kind of unfortunate. But the Mafia bribed the police to get a copy of the police report, found out who owned the vehicle, and then issued an extortion threat, and said, if you don't pay, I think it was $200,000 by 10 days from now, we're going to start violent actions against your employees.
Oh, man.
So our project didn't know, back in the United States, the headquarters didn't know if they even knew about us. Of course, they knew about the office in Moscow. Yeah. So we packed up in about 3 hours, not knowing we were ever going to come back, headed on the 5-hour trip to Moscow, checked into one of the big hotels under assumed names, and waited there until some of the directors and managers of the international division came out to talk about what we were going to do. And so we went back to the United States and camped in a hotel with a 14-year-old for a month to 6 weeks while they were working out, the safety, evaluating our safety. And we went back, John and I went back, but our project was able to pay for tuition for our daughter to go to a boarding school in Switzerland. So she spent part of 10th grade in the Swiss Alps learning to ski and making friends with a lot of children from all over the world.
And some Russians, too.
And some Russians, too.
Yeah.
That is so wild. Man, it's crazy that you would work in agriculture consulting and then get threatened by the mafia.
Yeah, right.
It's such a wild
right.
Well, and one of the interesting things is there are a lot of buyers of horticulture products from the village. I went back to this village in Russia when I worked in Ukraine for the State Department. I took some vacation time and flew up, stayed with my Russian tutor for 3 or 4 days, and most of the private farmers that we had worked with in that project, and there were 600 when we were working
Wow.
with them, and there were a handful left.
Hmm.
All of them had given up. And
Really?
they were raising vegetables and like carrots and cabbages and things like that. And it was kind of ironic. It was a lot of people from the Caucasus, like the Chechens and the Dagestanis, who were buying the vegetables to sell in the fresh markets in Moscow, the
And
farmers markets.
What made them want to give up? They just couldn't sell them, or?
Just couldn't make a go of it with I don't know whether raising small grains on, I think in that area they got maybe 5 acres when the big collective farm split up, and a few of them got tractors. I think everybody got a dairy cow.
Okay.
And it just didn't, it was not a feasible place, opportunity to raise a family anymore.
Well, even, I mean, if you're talking about the United States today, if you are going to do corn and soybeans, 200, no.
No.
300, no.
No.
500, probably not, unless you're really not planning on eating anything except bread. You really need, 750, 800 minimum to support a family,
Yes.
5, 6 people.
Yeah.
And then, but you guys don't need that. You got a lot more going on a lot smaller of a place here. And like I was saying, we had the privilege of touring it, and it was just so fascinating. I mean, for one, you have dunes of sand here in the middle of Iowa. You've got groves of trees. You've got giant mulch and compost piles. It's really incredible what started all of this. And we would love, because the viewers didn't, or the listeners had no idea what's going on here. What do you have on the farm, and how did that get started?
Well, so when we first got going, we wanted a place to live. And that's the last piece we've actually put together yet. We haven't built the house yet. So we built everything else. Nicholas and Kent, we had them for lunch today, and I said, here, I build live edge tables for people, and we ate on a plastic picnic table. So it just puts you in context of where our priorities are sometimes. But anyway, we got a small apartment that we stay in now off one of our buildings, and we've actually put time into actually developing the farm. We've never had a plan, though. I mean, for all the planning we've done in our business careers, this one we just kind of talk and say, well, what do we think about this, and we just kind of do it. Yeah. So it started with the building, the shop here that we're in now, and we wanted to do something in wood. And so we bought a sawmill. It came out of New Zealand. And we got it, and we said, well, yeah. So I started to cut slabs, live edge slabs for tables and things. And, well, this is fun, but now we need to dry it. So then we bought a kiln that came out of off the East Coast here. And it's a vacuum kiln. It's kind of a unique style, one of the few in Iowa. And then we said, well, what do we do with the ground? And so we probably, what would it have been, 6-7 years ago? We did the prairie, some of the native.
Oh, it's only been like 4 years.
4 years?
We do have a long-term goal in that we want a house and we want land that 95-year-olds can live on, because we're going to be there.
Yeah.
In like 50 years.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, don't we wish? So that was one of the, and I was always been fascinated by native prairie, and I grew up in Illinois, and there weren't many places that had any native prairie.
Sure.
We watched, especially John's parents had a very large yard, and they kept mowing until their late 80s and trying to keep everything up, and I thought putting as much of our land into native prairie is one way that we're going to get out of mowing.
Yeah, right.
Amen.
And we're going to have a beautiful environment and enjoy the butterflies and the bees and hummingbirds and pollinators. And so we started, I think it's been about 4 years. This is the fourth year now. We bought seed from Nicholas, from Hoxie Seed, and seeded about 4 acres. And so, every year it's a discovery of something new is starting to grow and flower, and I bought some books to help learn to identify native plants, and it's a wonderful discovery process, because the prairie, establishing a native prairie, takes time, and different plants come up early, and other plants, we didn't see anything for year 2 or year 3, and now in year 4 we're seeing some new things, and we really saw the prairie grasses come on last year in year 3, so it's been fun.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I think of what you guys have done here, and you think of prairie as a historical thing in the Midwest, it's sadly, and I could talk for hours with you guys because you have an eye for the landscape. What was it when you were growing up compared to now? And, have things gotten better? Have some things gotten worse? But that might be for another podcast. But one thing I think of with what you've done here is really in the spirit of those first people, European settlers that would have been staring at the, west banks of the Mississippi River and thinking of the possibilities for maximizing their chunk of ground, and that's really what you guys have done. You've seen it as well with 41 acres. We can't be corn and bean farmers and live on that. So we got to be creative. What can we do? We don't want to mow, so let's bring in some prairie. we have some of these invasive species that we need to get rid of, and then we need to plant some of these natives in place. We also need to have a crop, some kind of cash crop, so to speak, that we can make, money off the ground. And really, when you think about it, it's a modern version of pioneering and settling.
Yeah.
I think that's so cool. That's something that almost gets lost from farming, the creativity that farming should have, just like those original settlers had. They had to be so creative to make it work out, far from all their families and back in the East Coast, and there wasn't the general store right up the road to bail them out. There was no guarantee on what they were growing was going to give them enough money to get the other utensils that they could buy elsewhere, and so I think that what you guys are doing is very cool in that sense. From it's almost like we've circled back in history to and really, isn't that the way forward?
Yeah, because when I was growing up, my dad and my uncle actually farmed some of this ground, and it was corn and soybeans. Now, can you imagine having corn and soybeans out here in these sand hills?
Yeah.
And so then when we purchased it, we had it in the Conservation Reserve Program, but we opted to actually plant hardwoods. So Nancy and I put in about 9,000 trees.
Wow.
Back in I think late 90s.
Yeah, like 90s.
Yeah, and we were viewed as crazy. I mean, it was like no one put CRP into hardwoods because you can't farm it. Well, we had no intention of farming this in crop ground. Yeah. So that was kind of the start of this piece. And then, so we always knew we weren't going to field crop it at all. It had to be something different. So we did that. We started the sawmill business, and then and selling tables and things. And then Nancy came up with another idea. So
I'm a farm girl. I grew up on a farm. I'm the 6th generation to own the family farm in Illinois.
That's
we settled in
fantastic.
1840.
Wow.
I decided when I was 12 years old in the early 70s that I wanted to farm. And not many girls in the 70s ever said, I want to be a farmer.
Right.
I told my dad I want to be a farmer. And he said, if you want to be a farmer, you need to study agribusiness, and you need to learn the business side. But my grandmother and my mother were great gardeners, and I grew up with their flower gardening and their love of flowers. And I guess, we spent 18 years living in apartments between the Foreign Service and the 3 years we were in Russia and Ukraine. And I didn't have a garden of any kind. And I think that coming back after 15 years of being in the Foreign Service, when I came out here, it was like, what am I going to do?
Yeah.
And my my inclination was to dig in the dirt.
Yeah.
And honestly, the soils really have driven the decisions that I've made about the horticulture production. So
That's how it should be.
yes,
That's a big deal.
yes. And when we lived in Washington, D.C., and our daughter actually lived in the area, one afternoon or one weekend, she said, "Oh, Mom, I got a Groupon for a U-Pick lavender farm." And we went out on a Sunday afternoon to a U-Pick lavender farm in Virginia that was just
Okay,
outside
yeah.
the D.C. metro area. And it was the most magical experience I had ever had.
That's cool.
Walking around a field of purple,
Yeah.
picking lavender. And I knew that lavender grew in tough soil, that it doesn't like water, it does not like wet feet, it likes low productivity soil, and it will handle droughty soils. And so it was a year ago, January, sitting in a middle of COVID, middle of a cold Iowa winter. I started looking around to see how much small lavender plants were. I knew
Sure.
I couldn't afford buying $10 plants. And I found some nurseries that sell plugs.
Okay.
So I ordered a bunch of lavender plugs, and they arrived. And then John and I, like over 1,000 lavender plugs.
Wow.
And, John and I were looking at each other like, well, now what do we do? So we got out with the tape measure, and we have a field at the bottom of the hill. That's actually the best soil that we have.
Okay.
And it actually has some silt in it.
Not just saying.
And we measured out the rows, and we got a bulb auger that's works on a drill and
Okay.
drilled holes, 1,000 of them. And John helped me plant 1,000 lavender plugs. And then we had to go on a trip. We came back, and they were completely covered in weeds. And I looked at it like, oh my gosh, this was almost an acre of lavender plants. And I thought, how am I ever going to get this weeded? Well, John grabbed a hoe, bless his heart, and he was out there and I was out there, and we weeded for 3 or 4 days to
Wow.
get the weeds down. And then I knew that I was never going to keep up. So this was just last year, 2021. I knew it was not going to keep up. So I did some inquiries trying to find some part-time summer help, and like FFA students, couldn't find anybody. Ran an ad in Indeed.com and found a young woman, Abby, who now works for us full-time. And the farm is called the Lavender Farm at Sutliff because we're just a half a mile south of the old Sutliff Bridge on the Cedar River, just south of Lisbon, northeast of Solon. And it's a little village that actually, John's got a lot of roots in Sutliff, and he'll tell you about.
Yeah.
So it's the Lavender Farm at Sutliff.
Love it. Yeah, it's fun to see how it's come full circle like that,
Yeah.
and even incorporates some of those previous experiences you had outside of Iowa when you were, in Washington, D.C., and time spent with your daughter, great memory, bring it back here.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this ground is very unique. I've never seen soil like this in Iowa before, and I've been to, I think, pretty much every corner of Iowa, and it's a unique farm, but it's perfect for exactly what Nancy mentioned with
Yeah.
growing the lavender.
We put up a couple new buildings here in the last 4 or 5 years, and the concrete company, the place that provide the concrete, the owner came out, and he was looking around at the soil, and he says, this would make a great sand plant. He goes for his concrete mix.
Yeah, I bet.
Well, I didn't know if my feelings were hurt or what.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I think.
But he nailed it. He was, very truthful.
That was his version of a compliment,
that was
right?
it,
Well,
Actually, a lot of horticultural plants like well-drained soils.
Yeah.
So what we lack is organic matter in our soil. And unfortunately, we haven't had time yet to get our soil sampling done to really know where we're at.
Sure.
But we do know that the corn suitability ratings of these soils are up here on the hill. It's 17.
Wow.
17.
Wow.
At the bottom of the hill, it's like, I don't know, 143, 126, something
you might
like
want
that.
to do something about that. I don't know, just a suggestion.
So that's why one of our priorities is compost.
Yeah.
And working on compost. We've just got a worm composting bin, and we're going to get started with
Love it.
worm composting.
Oh,
Love it.
And
if you guys are watching on YouTube, I'm posting a picture right now because this compost mountain is so big.
Yeah, it's a great
that's
start.
cattle manure, and
Yeah.
wood chips that we have plenty of.
Mine fits in like a large, just like a bucket at home, and theirs is just a house of compost.
Yeah, it's
Well, but I do think the lavender thought comes from, we were in Crimea probably 20-some years ago, and
Yeah.
we happened to be, and it's fairly rough soil there, and dry climate, and we came across probably a 600-acre lavender field.
wow.
And it just made such an impression on me. You could just smell the lavender scent. And I think that scent just kind of stuck in Nancy's head for all
Yeah.
those years.
Yeah.
And
There's a lot of
Yeah.
association, between
Yeah.
smell and memory.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
my favorite flower that we grow out at Hoxie is Rattlesnake Master, and it's a beautiful flower, but it's the smell that really, when it's in the room, you just know there's Rattlesnake Master in here somewhere.
It's almost minty, but
Yeah.
it's strong. It's pervasive.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so we know you have an event coming up this weekend. That's a little taste of the future. Overall, what is your hope long term for the farm here? What other big projects would you like to tackle in the next several years?
Well, actually, I think we've bit off a big slice
Oh,
right now.
yes.
I want to focus on perennials. So we are planting hundreds of perennials this year. And Abby's been doing a lot of the planting because I really like the labor savings that comes with perennials. Is once we get the plants or the shrubs in the ground, then we don't have to worry about the planting in the springtime.
Right.
And our farm has been no-till for 30 years in Illinois, and I'm a big no-till person. And I think that we're developing the U-Pick lavender, and we're going to be developing products from lavender. So I hope to buy a
Awesome.
still, and we'll distill lavender to make essential oil and lavender water, and like
That's
lavender
awesome.
candles and things like that, sachets and that type of thing.
That's
One
really
of the
cool.
big areas next is going to be working on agroforestry. We have a lot of timber. We've got about 25 acres of timber. We've cleaned up a really nice portion of it, and that has deer fencing around it. So I had planted hazelnuts, and a few years ago when we planted about 700 trees together, the deer ate all of them the first winter. They left the hardwoods, the trees, like the oaks and the hickories and things like
Yeah.
that, thankfully, but they completely mowed the hazelnuts.
Yeah.
And I'm starting to study hazelnuts, but they are, from what I understand, they're an understory crop. So that's one potential.
Yeah, that's great.
Mushroom production is another one. We
Yeah.
talked a little bit about that this morning. And we're also starting a shade garden of perennials that grow in shade. So we're starting wild ginger and a stilby. And next year I want to get like bleeding heart and some other beautiful flowers that are definitely shade loving. plants.
Yeah.
I'd love to look into ginseng, and we found a grape that is winter hardy and is a shade tolerant plant. I can't think of the name of it right now, but we also have a fair number of berries. And
Yes, yeah. We got to taste some of those today.
Yes, and I wanted to get some unusual berries. I knew
You
maybe
did just
we'd
that.
never,
Yes.
we would never compete with going head to head with somebody who's established in raspberry and blueberry production.
Yeah, right.
But I've chosen service berries, which are June berries, honeyberries, elderberries, currants. I love currants, and gooseberries, and
Goji.
goji berry. Yep.
Yes.
Gojis and hardy fig. So, and we've started wild plums.
So why the berries? Why is there a pull with berries? You kind of talked about the lavender, but
everybody loves berries, and
That's
I love
true.
berries, and I love to make pies. That's one of the things I work on.
They're
is
one of the
trying to
most
perfect-
versatile fruits, you know.
Yes.
When you have apples, there's only so much. You can do apple slices, you can make applesauce, maybe make an apple pie, but
Yeah.
after that, can't really cut up apples.
about as
Yeah.
versatile.
Throw 'em on
as-
your
as
cereal, but
Nancy,
berries-
The berries.
Yep, berries are just they're the perfect fruit.
But I also think beyond these projects that we're working on is some kind of succession. We're really looking because eventually we are going to retire completely at some point.
Sometime. Remember, we're going to be around
We're
till
rooting for you,
95.
John.
Yeah,
We
that's
believe in you.
So we're looking for, we'd like to foster some, younger talent to come in that maybe can't, afford to get into farming. Now, this is not a typical farm, so I mean, it's something they can contribute labor to. And
Yeah.
I think we've got the ground and some of the capital expense, but eventually we'd like to bring a younger generation in to kind of keep this enterprise going.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Have a
Yeah.
legacy,
Yeah.
not just in name, but also in product, in
Yeah.
service, in
Yeah.
land, and in reputation.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
that's really cool. I mean, Dad's in that place too, right? He's 66, and he's looking at, okay, what's the next step where I'm not doing all of this work, and I didn't just spend all of these like thousands of hours and decades of my life, producing something that ends with me and carry on. And I think that is super cool. I think particularly something that you guys have done really well. Kent was talking about the creativity, and creativity, I think it means something different now than it used to. Right now it means that someone likes to paint or draw or make furniture or do something artsy. But 300 years ago, creativity meant you got to live a little longer because you were able to figure out how
ingenuity.
to grow fruit. Yes, exactly. And I think that's the kind of creativity you all have stepped into. And with creativity comes messiness. Doesn't matter what kind of creativity. My wife flips furniture. She's very creative. She's incredible at it. But there is mess with that. There's furniture all around the house. There's paint in places. We've got a room that's just designated for that messiness. But I mean, when we were touring the farm, you were talking about keeping critters out of your. I mean, most farmers aren't worried about that. In fact, 200 years ago, that was really normal. 100 years ago, that was a very normal thought. We needed to keep the animals from eating our food that we're growing for us. Well, today, that's not a thought at all for most farming. It's it's such a large scale, at least in row crop, it's such a large scale.
Yeah.
You're not even worried
That's true.
about.
That's a good point.
So with the creativity that you're doing, you actually have mess in terms of critters coming to try and eat your food. And you guys have very creative fences and all sorts of things, but it's not in a box. Nothing you guys are doing is in a box, and you're having to figure out as you go. And not only does it take brains, but I think more than that, it takes going after it and just deciding you're going to get it done no matter what it takes. And I've seen kind of what you guys have done with that, and it is incredible. I have
you.
loved seeing it.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's very well said, Nicholas. I mean, I think it sums it up well, and I really do want to applaud you for your vision for the future by having a new generation of farmers come in. There's to kind of paint the picture of what farming is like now. My wife and I, we just moved our family to our family farm on my mother's side. And my grandfather, he farmed it after his dad farmed it, and his grandfather bought it for his dad. They were the neighboring farm down the road. And, that was just what you did. And my grandpa's brother, he went and farmed the other grandparents' farm when he left the house. And today on that road, which you look in every direction, we're surrounded by cropland, right? We're surrounded by farmland. There's not one farmer on my road until you get about maybe 3 miles down the road. And everything is tied up by some, large farm operation that's cash renting the ground. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but the idea here is who's connected to that ground.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Who is making the call on how that ground is treated, the critters that live there, the air quality, the water quality, right? And if we don't start getting people, another generation brought in, as John said, putting that sweat equity into it, the labor that they did themselves, something that they can look back on when they're at that retirement age and thinking about who the next person is we're gonna lose all that care altogether,
Yeah.
So
and then once you have large commercial farms, crop farms, typically you start to lose that community. I mean,
Yep. Yes.
There's just not enough people there for sustainability.
Yeah.
Yep.
They're not your neighbor anymore. They're your
Not your
competitor for land.
Well, you can
And that's
remember
sad.
years ago, you always had like the elevator in town. I mean,
Yeah.
that was the hub
Yeah.
and things, and now it's a private farm that owns the elevator. Typically, the
Yeah.
co-ops moved out to a larger facility, and all
Yep.
these small town elevators are typically just owned by one farmer
Yeah.
anymore, and so you lose all that. Yeah.
Yep. And
I grew up in a town of 650.
Mhm.
It's down to 600 now. It's Grand Ridge, Illinois.
Hmm.
And we had kindergarten through 8th grade and had to go 10 miles away to high school. And the school has shrunk by half from the size it was when I was in school. But the community has still stayed fairly vibrant because people in the community realize it's a great place to raise children.
Yeah.
And it's a great place for families. And that's where I think that the horticulture operations and the specialty crops that are different from corn and soybeans,
Yep.
that maybe it's organic production too,
Yeah.
that bring more people to the land and
Mhm.
bring
Yeah.
people back to small scale holdings
Yep.
where they can be a part of smaller communities and be a part of our rural school systems, that I'm really excited to be working with horticulture crops finally in my life.
Yeah.
I grew up, but we had corn, soybeans, wheat, and alfalfa. So we had a fairly diverse operation with no livestock when I was growing up. But there's just, to me, there's a lot of value. People can get a foothold into farming with non-traditional crops, like
Yes.
horticulture crops, or there's some exciting things that we've talked about today
Oh,
about
yeah.
raising native prairie grasses and forbs and flowers
Yep.
for seed production, because fortunately there's been a lot of investment of people's time and USDA funds to go into conservation areas.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to be looking at possibilities of raising seed for perhaps Hoxie to buy some seed off of us from the native grasses and
We love
flowers that we've got started, and
Yes.
We love it.
potential for a little bit more down the road.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. We there's in my opinion, there's not enough prairie and wildflower seeds, to go around to as much. And I remember for a while thinking, oh, man, our industry is propped up by government spending. I don't like that at all. And my dad sat me down and he explained, no, it's propped up by people wanting clean air and clean water, right? And so that the way that the public is paying for it is through the government, through their taxes.
Yeah.
But it's because we have this this need, this basic human need, that food and waters, two of the three or two of the four. And I think, it's so important, the native aspect of it, but there are many others. I believe lavender's not native to Iowa, is it?
No, it's native of the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
So Greece, Turkey, some of the dry, arid areas of southern Europe is where lavender.
And I was thinking it was overseas, but so something like that where it's not necessarily native, but you can do smaller production and live off the land and live very connected to the land. Because similarly, when the president of a huge company isn't connected to the people at the bottom, often isn't treating them well. Well, people who own land but aren't connected to their land often have a hard time treating it as well.
And it's diverse, right? So, as somebody who would call themselves a conservationist myself, anytime you can promote natives, fantastic. However, even if we turned this entire state back into 80% prairie like it was at one point, where are the bison? Where are the elk? Where are the black bears? Where are the mountain lions? Where are the wolves? You don't have... Where are all the species that have gone extinct? You can't ever have 100% what you once did, right?
Yeah.
And that's the argument for the pheasant, right? When we went up and talked with Bob and Howard from Pheasants Forever, a lot of times that's a criticism. Why are you promoting something that's not a native? Well, the native birds that were here, we don't have them anymore. And they fit, and it's diverse. They're filling a new modified niche on this modified landscape. And anytime you can bring in more diversity instead of just a monoculture that we see in almost every direction, it's a win because, yes, it's awesome to have that perfect preserved. It's kind of like restoring an old car, right? Have that numbers matching 1970 Chevelle LS6, 454 big block, SS trim. But if you can't find the matching motor and tranny to go with the frame and the body, a crate engine will do, right? It's still a cool car. And it's kind of that way when you look at our landscape now. If you can't have the exact thing, well, let's make it as good as we can, and that's bringing diversity in. And that can mean having non-native species on the landscape that people are raising for a crop instead. Because when we were walking down there in that lavender, I mean, I took a video of it. There were butterflies or bees or all these pollinators that are saying, hey, you know what? We don't have our prairie anymore. Hey, look, there's some lavender.
Yeah.
We have that.
Yeah.
And it's solving another problem just by having that diversity.
I think it's important to note that we're not looking for a road back to what was. We're looking for a road forward.
Right.
Not to the end of a cliff where we fall off of it, So
very well
what path brings us forward and continues to bring us forward. But we are nearing the end of our time. But before we go, there are going to be lots of people, I'm sure, that are going to have questions. I mean, you guys are so filled with knowledge and interesting things that people, I guarantee you, people are going to have questions. How can people reach out to you? How can they get connected with your farm? I mean, you even mentioned having more people work on the farm and passing along. If someone was interested in seeing what you had or maybe coming to a U-Pick Day, how would they reach out to you guys?
We have the Lavender Farm at Sutliff on Instagram and Facebook.
It is very good. I follow them.
So it's just all one word, the Lavender Farm at Sutliff. And then I'm working on our website for the Lavender Farm.
Yes.
And I'm getting close.
You're getting close.
It's a lot of work.
And we're hoping to open this Sunday or next Wednesday for You Pick Lavender.
Okay.
And we'll be announcing on Instagram and Facebook.
What date is that, just in case we don't, for whenever this is posted?
So the dates would be
26th and
thank you, John. 26th and 29th of
June
June.
26th and 29th.
We're going to try to be open on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays for You Pick Lavender. As the berries come on, I want to make jam and jellies, and then we have a slot at the Iowa City Farmers Market as we start to come up with some products to sell. Hope to have some more cut flowers later in the summer. I am working on the website for the Stonehouse Timber Sawmill and Kiln. It's not up and running yet, so the best you know,
Yeah,
I
what's
think
the best way
is
for someone to order a table?
Best way, I think, is to get in touch with us through the Instagram, Facebook,
Sure.
or the Lavender Farm website.
Yeah.
And I'll pass the info to John, and when I can get the Lavender Farm website up and running, then I can return to finishing the sawmill website. And
Wow.
people have most of the tree removal services in eastern Iowa are aware of us, and furniture makers
Awesome.
in the area are aware of us to find out about our service, the work we do with
Yeah.
the mill and the kiln, and then selling slabs and providing those services of milling, sawmilling, and kilning wood
Sure.
for people.
Yeah, the derecho brought us probably 2 years worth of work.
Yeah.
Wow.
I could
Yeah.
Cedar Rapids, yeah, just
Yep.
amazing.
You got a pile of trees sitting
Yeah.
out. And,
Yeah.
And a big compost pile
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
benefited from that too. No, well, we thank you so much, Nancy
Thank
and
you.
John, for sharing your place, and
yeah.
This was really fun. Thank you for interviewing
Yeah.
us. We've
very
had a good time.
inspirational.
Yeah.
Very inspirational.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much to you guys for listening in. This has been the Prairie Farm. We are presented by Hoxie Native Seeds. And do not forget, just as you have seen today, conservation happens 1 yard at a time. See you next time.